Hello and welcome to Spectator TV, a special edition of Spectator TV, because we're going to be talking about not the British election that's coming up in a few days' time, but the French elections, which happened last night. And it looks as though the well-recognised gamble that President Emmanuel Macron took in calling an election for the French Assembly has backfired. Since the national rally, Marine Le Pen's national rally, won just over 33% of the vote, and they are in a strong position to win a majority on Sunday, but it's by no means guaranteed. It's a pretty tumultuous moment in French politics, so who better to talk about it with than our chairman, Andrew Neil, and the journalist Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. Andrew, the gamble has backfired, but it's not over. Things are still in flux in French politics.
Oh, yes, they're still in flux because it's a two-round system. The second round will take place on Sunday. The two-round system makes it quite hard to project share of the vote into actual seats. So what do we know as things stand roughly at the moment? Well, I think we know for sure that the National Rally will be the largest party in the new National Assembly when it gathers. And that if anybody's to have an overall majority, it will be the National Assembly. What we don't know is whether it will have that yet. But it's quite well placed. I mean, the markets in the immediate aftermath, the markets have been down on France since Mr. Macron called the election. The markets this morning took a bit up because they started to think, oh, Madame Le Pen, her party, they might not get an overall majority. Even the Financial Times is saying that might be a bit rose-tinted. The markets could be getting this wrong at the moment. The one thing which is beyond doubt, which cannot be overemphasized, is that the biggest loser by far is President Macron. And I don't really see how he recovers from this. And I think there are no good outcomes for France because if it gets a majority national rally government, then, who knows what that will mean. But if it doesn't if it either ends up with some kind of minority government or possibly with no government at all, it just becomes a sea of instability, which isn't good either. So it's fascinating, but it's not great for the old hexagon.
Just on that point about markets, Andrew, I mean, I see that, yes, that they were probably betting that there might not be a national rally majority, but could it also be that markets just aren't as scared of the old National Front as they used to be because it has changed?
That's probably true, that they're not as... I mean, people in general outside the left are not as scared of the National Rally now as they used to be because Madame Le Pen has gone through a kind of sanitization process with it, and her young protege, Mr. Bardella, seems relatively reasonable, and they've kind of purged the anti-Semitism and got rid of her father's roots, Madame Le Pen's roots, which were neo-fascist, and the party was founded by him and by a proper Nazi. So, but that's kind of gone now. But I think the markets, initial market reaction is usually wrong. I think when the markets think about this, if we're moving into a period where either there'll be weak government or almost no government at all because the National Assembly can't choose one, or it'll be back like the Fourth Republic when governments changed all the time. The old joke in Whitehall was, oh, I've been to Paris and spoken to one of the French governments in these days. Then I think the markets will realize that France's situation on national debt, its situation on the deficit, cannot be repaired in that kind of political environment. And I think they'll then turn again on France.
And Elizabeth, we talked a lot about fear of the right in France, and pretty much Emmanuel Macron's political career has been boosted all along by a fear of the right. But we're also seeing an emerging quite strong left, particularly in the cities, and also a fear of the left, perhaps helping National Rally and not the centre ground.
The fear of the left is something entirely different. First of all, because the National Rally isn't violent. I mean, they do not bring people in the street to riot. And even yesterday was supposed to be, quote unquote, just a demonstration. part of the demonstrations breaking up shop windows, because why not break the shop window? And sometimes the demonstrations became riots, and sometimes riots were supported by the hard left, because one part of the hard left, the core of Jean-Luc Melenchon's LFI, La France Insoumise, France Unbowed, are movements that are completely racialist, that have taken the worst of American racialism, that have created the whole gamut of woke expression straight from America. Some of them have actually gone to America and studied in America and been invited because they were minority people, and come back and they invent those forbidden to whites movement. They take over the best universities and grandes écoles in France, places like École Normale Supérieure, and they have all this complete nonsense of woke stuff. And of course, they all got suddenly worked up on the Palestinian issue, which has become the issue on which the European campaign was waged on the left. The La France Insoumise, which is the part of the new Popular Front party that looks like it's going to have the most MPs, and who radicalized places like the cities. Paris is red now. And these people have all those issues that you see in Columbia University, that you see in some British universities as well. And your normal French person looks at this and says, what on earth have I got to do with this? What on earth have I got to do with classes that are forbidden to Zionists, which means Jews, at Sciences Po, the school that created the French political elite over the century? And this disconnect has actually served the National Rally, and to some extent it has served the center, but the center has been wishy-washy. And therefore, I would say that 80% of the benefit is in the rally, and 20% would go to someone like Gabriel Attal, Macron's prime minister for the past 5 months, who is actually, he's an interesting law and order type in a very different way than you can think of, and who probably has a future career, because when he was campaigning for the snap election, there's footage by mainstream television channels following him, of him sort of greeting people in the street. Difficult for a Macronist nowadays. And people would say, look, I hate him, I like you, but you have to separate from him. And that was really interesting. That was caught on camera. So that's a possibility in the future. But right now, the name of Emmanuel Macron is mud. And it's more a question that how you work out each constituency is different, each order to the MPs that will, the aspiring MPs that will remain after the free-for-all of last Sunday. Next Sunday, you have to have scored at least 12.5% of registered voters to be allowed to remain in the second round. There are about 300 cases out of 577 constituencies in which at least 3 people have scored that, and therefore it's all a question of who is the spoiler candidate, and to whom will the spoiler candidate give, so to speak, their votes. And that would mean stepping back. Macron has asked, and Attal have asked their voters, who probably will come, who already have come third in many of the contests, to step down, to bar the road to the fascist, i.e. the National Rally, and to step down even for somebody from La France Insoumise. Macron's first minister, Edouard Philippe, who was his prime minister between 2017 and 2020, Edouard Philippe has said everything in what he calls the Republican arc, which means no France Insoumise, no France Unbowed, and no National Rally. And that already sort of splits things. And there's a whole variety of ways that people in the center on the left say, I will support some people to prevent National Rally from getting in, but not all of them. That's the big thing. And I think Jean-Luc Melenchon himself, who wants riots in the street more than he thinks he wants, or certainly thinks he can win a total majority, is pushing for this. When we had the results on Sunday night, Mélenchon appeared very soon after the close of the polling stations, and he said he was speaking for the left-wing union, the New Popular Front, but he had only France unbowed France Insoumise people next to him. He had one of the most radical MPs who was re-elected in Marseille straight away. And he had Rima Hassan, the Syrian-born supposed Palestinian, who essentially is a pro-Hamas, pro-Assad candidate. And she was wearing a keffiyeh until, so that you got the message. Yes. Mélenchon is a wily old man. He knew perfectly well what he was doing. He wanted to scare off people and radicalize the situation.
Well, Andrew, I saw Anne-Elisabeth touched on the cities element there, and I saw you talking about this on Twitter or X, that this is just a pattern of Western politics now, isn't it? That cities are becoming more and more left-wing, sometimes radically left-wing, yes. And the rest of the countries are increasingly conservative.
It is a modern psephological feature in the 21st century that metropolitan areas tend to the left and provincial areas, smaller towns, rural areas tend to the right. That's true in Britain now. London, which used to had a conservative mayor and living mayor in memory called Boris Johnson, is now overwhelmingly Labour. All the other major cities are too, whereas the more provincial areas are less so. That's true in France as well. It's true Manhattan is 87% Democrat. Los Angeles is the same. But of course, Alabama, Mississippi, the rural areas, the western states, bar California, are much more Republican. It's true in Germany as well. Berlin is very left-wing. The areas all around it are not at all left-wing. In fact, they're pretty right-wing. So that's a big dividing line now in our politics. Metropolitan areas versus provincial, smaller towns, even smaller cities, rural areas.
And Anne-Elisabeth, do you think that perhaps France is slightly ahead of the curve or the direction in which politics seems to be heading in the West? Because its major parties have already been eviscerated. The old Socialist Party, the old Les Républicains Party, the centre-right, the centre-left have been destroyed. And Macron had this great success of doing a kind of pop-up party in En Marche, which was a brilliant coup for him when he won power. But the problem with pop-up parties is they can tend to go pop pretty quickly. And it looks like that's happening to him now.
Yes. I mean, what's really interesting is that Macron was running the presidency and his party the way a French boss runs the company, which is entirely top-down and dictatorial. So he treated his cabinet ministers like subordinates, and he treated his MPs like employees. And now that people dare say no to him, which you don't do in a French company, we started seeing people, people we knew from before, but also people from his own party who had personalities, except they had completely vanished as long as he was the king or Jupiter. And that's really a great change in French politics. I think that there is a way for the old parties to splinters of them or parts of them to rejuvenate themselves. The Républicains could come back. It's a narrow window of opportunity, but I see it because suddenly we saw politicians whom we'd known for 30 years, and they would come on television on the night of the first round, and they looked logical, they looked sensible, they knew lots of stuff, they had a hinterland. I don't know how much of them appeal to everyone, but you thought, this is what politics used to be like, and it's not that bad. So there's an opening. It may not work out. And the young politicians, we are going to see a new sort of a generation from the disaster. That's when you forge the personality of tomorrow's politician. It's when they're waiting to have power. When they've got power, that it goes too fast. They can't change everything. So I'm less pessimistic. I think the legacy parties have an opportunity still.
Well, Andrew, Nigel Farage, of all people, threw in some criticism of Marine Le Pen yesterday. It seems sort of trying to establish some distance between him, or certainly National Rally, and Reform. And I wanted to just ask you about how it looks from Britain, because we've got this election coming up that's actually been quite boring, really, overall. Labour cruising towards what looks like a certain large victory. And France in sort of chaos. So what do you think that British people should think about what the condition of France, particularly given Brexit and our future relationship with the European Union?
I mean, I think there are a lot of implications for Britain in what's happening in France. Indeed, there are a lot of implications for the rest of Europe as well. I think one of the implications is for Keir Starmer, likely to be the next British Prime Minister. which is that the Europe we voted to leave in 2016 is not the Europe of today. The Europe of today is very different. Different political forces at work. You now have quite strong Eurosceptic governments in Italy, in Holland, in Hungary, and now probably in France. Anti-Brussels governments. Nobody's talking about Frexit or getting out of the euro, but these are not part of the European mainstream or the Brussels consensus. They're against open borders. They're against ever closer union. In some ways, they're much more Gaullist, much more nation-state type European. That's a big change. That would be a problem for Mr. Starmer, who is much cozier with the traditional European consensus. I think for the Conservatives, the lesson there is if they're heading for a major thumping and could be reduced to a rump on Thursday, then how does the right rebuild itself? Because it's quite hard to see anywhere where the right is doing well, which does not now involve the populist right. That is obviously true in France. It is true in Italy. It's true in Holland as well. And obviously it's true in Hungary too. So what more role would Reform, Farage, that populist right, play in any rebuilding of the Conservative Party? That's going to be a difficult one. But where else do you go if Mr. Starmer is straddling the centre ground? And then I think the other lesson, which is a longer term lesson, and one that Mr. Starmer should think for even as he heads to a famous victory, is that what happened in France, what is unfolding in France, is the defeat of the centre and the failure of centrist policies. These are exactly the policies which Keir Starmer is going to be elected on. If he fails in Britain, and don't forget his policies are obsessed with net zero, pretty relaxed about immigration, high taxes, industrial strategy, metropolitan-based, metropolitan concerns rather than provincial concerns. If he fails, well, I can tell you this, Britain ain't going further left. There's only other one way it is going, and that is to the more populist right. So there are many lessons for Labour, Conservative, and the country as a whole. There's one short-term plus, and I never thought I would say this, and that is that if the markets are down on France, down on Paris, down on French financial assets, if they are, Starmer would be wise to depict Britain as an island of stability and do nothing. It happened way back in 1936 when the then Popular Front, the left-wing Popular Front, formed a government and money poured out of Paris into London. If Mr. Starmer knows anything, which I'm not sure he does on these matters, that should be a template for him.
Anne-Elisabeth, what do you think about that? Do you think, is that British gloating at French troubles?
Always. Yes, there's always a temptation. I mean, France has been gloating in sort of in great unease about Brexit. We've become obsessed about Brexit, and Macron kept on reminding people of what a complete disaster it was, quote unquote. It was, I mean, the French usually have not been obsessed with Britain, but that was something which hurt the image that the French, as sort of co-masters of Europe, had of themselves. I don't know whether this is going to happen. Certainly, I mean, it looks like Keir Starmer holds the Labour Party away from Jeremy Corbyn's excesses, and therefore the French have nothing against Keir Starmer in general. Even the French right has nothing against Keir Starmer. From Harold Wilson to all sorts of Blair to all sorts of socialist prime ministers. You had Labour prime ministers. That's not so much of a problem. But I'm also, one thing about the National Rally is they are extremely unaware of the world around France. They do not belong to the elites that everybody denounces. They don't speak English, really don't speak one word of English. They don't read in English. They don't understand the workings of the rest of the world most of the time. And that means that they have been very unclubbable I mean, I've been sort of traveling in countries where they have right-wing governments right now, and you see the Italians, and there are all sorts of international people with the Italians, the Melonistas, the people from the think tanks of Giorgia Meloni, and they all speak English. If you don't speak Italian, the Hungarians have got all sorts of foreigners coming in, and they speak English because nobody speaks Hungarian. The Dutch, of course, etc. The French are in the kind of little island, which means that the whatever sort of theorizing, and thank God Marine Le Pen is rather lazy in terms of intellectual speculation, the theorizing harks back to 19th century France much more than it looks like. It looks at sort of modern things. It has a baked-in loathing of America, or distrust of America, or para-Gaullist distrust of America. These are different strains, and they're more or less negative. Take someone like Nicolas Sarkozy, who didn't have that, who admired America. He was called Sarkozy l'Américain, and that was a massive insult. That was even worse than being le président bling bling. It was, but being the pro-American president, that was bad. And that's one dimension of, and that general ignorance about the rest of the world, and that sort of interest in Russia, because Russia has been cultivating the French right so much. You know, we were allies, we know one another, we don't like the Americans, and they paid people, they paid people's think tanks, they invited people to Russia, they treated them extremely well. So you've got this whole dimension in which essentially the sort of lack of awareness, a susceptibility to the tropes of Russian propaganda, and next to that, a kind of naivete about the outside world. I suspect some of the younger people within Le Pen's party are much better, but that is the danger that I see if the National Rally gets in.
And finally, Andrew, how Eurosceptic are National Rally? I mean, if Marine Le Pen becomes president, as she well might now, will it put France on a collision course with Europe, or because of the other things that are happening in Europe, the other drift towards the right we're seeing in other countries, will the European Union just become a more right-wing union?
Well, let us start by reminding ourselves that France is already in special measures as far as Brussels is concerned. It's in breach of the Maastricht deficit and debt rules. So it's already in a bit of trouble and had its knuckles rapped. But I think the big worry in Brussels is that already you have Giorgia Meloni, who's not part of the mainstream in Italy. If you now have a national rally government in Paris, and of course France is much more important because it was one of the two main founding members of the European Union. If you've now got a government in Paris which is Eurosceptic, and by Eurosceptic, I don't mean that there's any move to take France out of the European Union. That would be absurd. There isn't even a move to go back to the franc. At one stage, Le Pen did talk about getting out of it. She then realized that French people really want their pensions paid in euros, not in what would be a new currency called the franc. And she depends on a lot of older votes. So that was dropped too. But it's Eurosceptic in the sense that it does not like the Brussels consensus, the sort of liberal soft left consensus of Brussels. It is against an ever closer union. It's more of a Europe des patries than a federal Europe. It's very much against net zero, which of course is a kind of religion in the Brussels consensus. And of course it's against open borders, not just open borders for Europe, but open borders within Europe. So you add that all together with Meloni thinking the same, Holland now thinking the same too, and you can see trouble coming down the pike for Brussels, which is not used to having major European governments that think differently from Brussels. That is undoubtedly a problem. And then even bigger issues of defence. Although the National Rally has kind of toned down its criticism, it's still pretty pro-Russian. It's still not a huge fan of Ukraine. It's still not a huge fan of NATO by any means. And I think that's danger for a wider Europe. At a time when Olaf Scholz in Germany is already part of the walking wounded, and now Macron is a lame duck, to have a government in Paris that is not a fan of NATO, talking about pulling out of the Central Military Command and has a soft spot for Russia, where does the leadership come from? Because I tell you this, it isn't going to come from Keir Starmer, who is a novice when it comes to geopolitics and foreign policy.
On that troubling question, I think we'll end it there. But Andrew and Anne-Elisabeth, thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV.